My name is Alakes, and I am writing this down because the men who survived with me are mostly dead now, and the ones who are still breathing do not like to speak. Someone has to put it in order. Someone has to say what the rock cost us and what we paid to take her back. We lived on a coast that no map of Earth would recognize. 2 suns, the small one cold and white, the large one a slow red eye that hung in the afternoon like a coal in ash. The sea was real enough, salt and wind and a tide that climbed twice a day, but the water ran black where it broke against the cliffs, and you learned early not to drink it even after the stills. We called the settlement Vora. It meant edge, in the old language my grandfather still spoke. We were the edge of human reach in that quadrant, and we knew it, and we did not pretend otherwise. Before the tributaries came, we worked the salvage. The colony ships that had not made orbit, the cargo skiffs that the storms above the headlands had pulled down out of the sky like swatted insects, the wrecks of the old terraformer that had failed 70 years before any of us were born and now lay half buried in the pine country above the bay. We pulled metal. We pulled fuel cells. We pulled bones when we had to, and we buried them properly because that is what you do. My father did that work and his father, and I started at 13, and by the time I was 30 I knew every cave and every fissure between the Cape and the high rock the locals called Pedralta. Pedralta was a stone the size of a chapel, balanced on a smaller stone, set there by no human hand and no glacier I knew of, and the old people said the world had been built around it. We believed them, more or less. There was nothing else to believe. The tributaries did not arrive. That is the wrong word. Arrival suggests ships and noise and a thing you can mark on a calendar. They surfaced. They came up out of the ground like a thought you have been trying not to have, and by the time we understood what they were the lower town was already gone, and old Marcel, who had taught me to gut a salvage drone with a paring knife, was sitting on his porch with his eyes open and nothing behind them. I will tell you what they looked like because I was close enough, more than once, to know. They were tall, taller than a man and built wrong for it, too narrow in the chest, the limbs too many and joined in too many places. Their shells were a pale glassy silica, the color of a wet stone, and the shells creaked when they walked, the way a tree creaks in a wind you cannot feel. They had no faces. There were sensory pits where a face should be, 4 of them, arranged in a square, and the pits moved independently and tracked you in a way that made your stomach turn over even when you were trying to be brave. Their mouths, if you want to call them that, were on the underside of the head, hinged, and they did not eat. We never saw one eat. We saw them drink sometimes from the Black Sea, but we never understood that either. What they wanted was inside us. That was the part nobody could accept at first because it sounded like a story a frightened child would tell. They wanted what was in our heads, not the brain itself, not the meat of it, the pattern, the memory, the shape of a life. They harvested it through resonance, through a kind of singing that their shells did, and when they were finished the body kept on living and the person was gone. You could put food in front of the body and the body would eat. You could speak to it and it would not answer. The pits would not focus. The pattern was somewhere else in their hive, in whatever passed for their library, and the person who had been your wife or your father or your daughter was a record now. A song one of those silica things could hum back to itself in the dark. We called them the tributaries because in the first weeks, when we still thought we could talk to them, my brother-in-law Geordie tried to broadcast on the old colony frequencies, and the only response we ever got back was a sound like running water. Not a voice, a flow. As if every memory they had taken was pouring through them at once, all the people they had emptied, all the rivers of us, feeding some larger sea we could not see. The name stuck. Geordie did not. They took him in the 2nd month, and his body kept the salvage shop running for another 6 weeks before it stopped knowing what a wrench was, and we had to bury him while he was still warm. That was the world before. I want you to understand the shape of it. We were not soldiers. Vora had no army. We had hunting rifles, a few obsolete pulse carbines the colony charter had let us keep when the orbital authority pulled its garrison 40 years back, and we had the salvage. We had the cliffs and the caves and the high pine country and Pedralta, the balancing stone, and the men and women who had lived their whole lives there and knew where the wind went at every hour of every season. That was what we had. The tributaries had numbers we could not count and a hive somewhere under the headlands that we could feel through our boots if we stood still long enough, a low pressure in the rock, a humming. They had the patience of something that did not measure time in human years, and they had, by the end of the first season, taken about a third of us. The inciting blow, if you want to call it that, was Bet. Bet was not my daughter. I had no daughter. I had no wife either, not since the fever that came through Vora when I was 26. Bet was Pear's daughter. Pear was what we called him, the old word for father, because he had taken in half the orphan children of the salvage families over the years, and nobody could remember his given name anymore even though we all knew it. Pear ran the lower workshop, the one nearest the water, and Bet had grown up in it the way other children grow up in gardens. She was 22 when the tributaries came. She was small and dark-haired and quick, and she had a way of looking at a broken piece of equipment as if she were listening to it, and more often than not she heard whatever it was trying to tell her and she fixed it. She had her mother's hands. Her mother had been gone a long time, and Pear did not talk about it, and the rest of us did not ask. The day they took Bet, I was up on the Cape with Vigilant. That was what we called him, Vigilant. It was not his name either. He had been a constable in the colony years before the garrison pulled out, and after that he had been the closest thing Vora had to a sheriff, which mostly meant breaking up fights at the salvage auctions and making sure the stills did not blow up. When the tributaries came, he had appointed himself the watch. He had a long glass and a battered carbine and a small concrete bunker he had built himself up on the highest point of the Cape, and he sat there at dawn and at dusk and he watched the headlands for movement. He was 68 years old, gray as ash, and he had the eyes of a man who slept 4 hours a night by choice. I liked him. I had liked him my whole life. We were drinking weak tea out of metal cups and the small white sun was coming up out of the sea, and Vigilant lowered his glass and said, very quietly, "Boy, look at the lower town." I looked. I was 31. I was nobody's boy anymore. I did not correct him because he was Vigilant and you did not correct Vigilant. There were 3 of them in the lower town. 3 tributaries, walking slowly between the workshops, their shells catching the morning light and throwing it back in the wrong color, that whetstone gray that did not belong in our world. They were not running. They never ran. They moved at the pace of a thing that had already decided where it was going and did not care how long it took to arrive. I knew before Vigilant said it. He said it anyway. They are at Pear's. We went down. We should not have. There was a protocol by then that the watch did not go down, that the watch reported and waited and the able-bodied gathered, and the gathering took an hour. And by the time the hour was over, whatever the tributaries had wanted was finished, and you went down afterward to bury what was left of the person and to keep using the body until it stopped knowing how to work. That was the protocol. Vigilant broke it. I broke it with him. We went down the goat path off the Cape with the carbines in our hands and our boots making more noise on the gravel than they should have. And by the time we got to the lower workshop, the tributaries had already left, and Pear was on his knees in the doorway, holding Bet, and Bet was looking at him with her eyes open and the pits of her, that human focus, gone. She was breathing. She was warm. She had been hollowed out while we walked. Pear did not scream. I will remember that until I am dead. He did not scream. He held her and he rocked once. And he looked up at me and he said, "Alakes, they took the song of her." That was how he said it, the song of her. I do not know if he meant her memories or her soul or both. I do not think there is a difference. Vigilant put his hand on my shoulder and his hand was shaking, which I had never seen, and he said, "We are going to have to do something." That is where the middle of it begins. The grind. I am going to tell you the grind honestly because I do not want anyone reading this to think it was clean. We tried to fight them first the way you would fight any enemy. Vigilant organized us. 24 men and women who could still shoot, who still had the steel for it. We set ambushes. We learned where the tributaries came up out of the ground, the wide cracks in the rock above the buried hive, and we set explosives at the mouths and we waited in the pines and we hit them when they came through. We killed 3 the first week. We killed 2 more the second. The shells broke if you put enough force into them. A pulse round at close range would crack the chest cavity and whatever was inside, some pale gray pulp that smelled like wet ash, would spill out and the long limbs would fold under it and the creaking would stop. We celebrated, the first time. We made a fire in Vigilant's bunker, and we drank what was left of Pear's cellar, and Pear himself sat in the corner with Bet's body and fed her broth from a spoon, and she swallowed without seeing him. There is a thing that happens to a man when he has killed something that should not have been killable, and I want to put it down honestly. You do not feel triumphant. You feel suspicious. You sit on a rock in the cold dawn and you look at the broken shell of the thing you killed, and you watch the pale gray pulp inside it slow down and stop moving, and you wait for the rest of the world to correct you. You wait for the second tributary, the bigger one, the one you have not seen yet. You wait for the consequence. We waited a long time that first month. The consequence did not come, and we mistook the silence for a victory. That was the first mistake we made, and it was the one that almost cost us everything. I had killed one of them myself by the end of the second week. I do not want to describe it in detail. It was at the mouth of one of the cracks above the old terraformer site in the gray hour, and I was lying in a pine needle bed with the carbine warm under my chin, and the thing came up out of the crack creaking, and I put 2 rounds into the chest of it from about 20 meters, and the second round did the work. The shell broke and the pulp came out in a wet slow pour, and the long limbs folded the way I have seen wet rope fold, and the thing went very still. I lay there for a long time afterward. I lay there until the white sun was up and my hands had stopped shaking enough to hold the rifle steady again. Then I went back down to the workshop, and I told Pear and I told Vigilant, and Vigilant nodded once, and Pear gave me a cup of soup, and Bet's body sat in the corner watching nothing, and I drank the soup and I went out and I cut wood for an hour because I needed my hands to do something a man's hands were supposed to do. By the end of the third week, we understood why the tributaries had not bothered to fight back. They had been taking us all that time somewhere else. They had been working the inland farms, the small holdings up the river that we had thought were already empty, and they had been working the fishing villages south of the Cape, and they had been working the salvage camps at the old terraformer site. They had not stopped because of us. They had let us have the lower town and the Cape because the lower town and the Cape were not where most of us lived. We had been a side concern. We had been a fence post they walked past on their way to the orchard. We learned this in pieces. A man named Quim, who I had known since school, went south to the fishing villages on a run for sealant resin, because the workshop still needed sealant resin and the war was not going to make the boat stop leaking. He took 2 days to get there and a day to come back, and when he came back he sat down in the workshop and he did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, that the villages were empty. He did not mean that the people were gone. He meant that the people were still in them. He had walked into the first village in the late afternoon, and there were 40 men and women and children sitting on the wharves and on the porches with their eyes open and their hands in their laps, and not one of them had looked up at him. He had walked into the second village, and it had been the same. He had walked into the third, and there had been tributaries in it, 3 of them, finishing the work, and he had hidden behind a fish drying rack for 2 hours and watched them go from house to house, and he had watched the singing, and he had not been able to make himself leave until the white sun went down, and he had walked all the way back to Vora on the cliff path in the dark. He told us this in a voice that did not rise once. Then he stood up and went home, and the next morning Pear went to check on him because Pear always checked on people, and Quim had hanged himself in his kitchen with a length of salvage cable. He had left a note. The note said only that he was not going to wait for them to come for him, and that he did not want any of us to take what was left of him. Pear burned the note. We burned Quim, because he had asked us to, in the pit behind the workshop where we had been burning bodies since the second month because the cemetery was a thing of the old world. Pear said the words his grandmother would have said. The wind took the smoke up the cape, and that was Quim. I tell you this because the histories will say the tributaries took us, but it is not that simple. The tributaries took most of us. Some of us we lost the other way. There was Esperanza, the widow who ran the still, who walked into the Black Sea one morning and did not walk out. There was old Salvador, who would not let his wife's body be buried even after she had been 3 months gone, and who sat in his house feeding her broth until she stopped knowing how to swallow, and then a little after that, and then he put the spoon down and he picked up his hunting rifle and he did the other thing, and we found them together. I did not blame him. I have not blamed anyone those years for any of the ways a man finds to be done. When Vigilant figured that out, he came back from the Cape one morning with a face like a man who has done his arithmetic and found the answer he was afraid of. He sat down in the workshop and he poured himself a cup of cold tea and he said, "There are maybe 200 of us left in the whole sector. We started at 4,000. We have 8 months at this rate. Maybe 6. Pear looked up from where he was holding Bet. Bet was eating bread by hand slowly with the patience of a machine. She did not look at her father. She had not looked at her father since the day she was taken. 8 months, Pear said. The word came out of him flat. And after that? After that, Vigilant said, we are all of us a song in their cellar and there is nobody to come looking. The orbital authority does not even know we are here. The charter expired in 51. We were not on anyone's list. We will not be on anyone's list. I want to be honest. I sat in that workshop and I felt something go out of me. I had been angry for 3 weeks. Anger had been my fuel. Now I was looking at the bottom of the cup and there was no anger left and there was no plan. And there was Pear holding the woman who had been his daughter and feeding her bread. And there was Vigilant doing the arithmetic of how long it would take for the rest of us to go the same way. That was the night Pear spoke about Pedralta. Pedralta, the balancing stone, the chapel-sized rock on the smaller rock, up in the high pine country, that the old people said the world had been built around. Pear had grown up on the legends. His grandmother had told him, and he told us that night, sitting by the workshop fire with Bet asleep beside him because the body still slept even though the person did not. The legend was this. There had been a man in the old country, the country on earth that nobody our age had ever seen, and the man had lost what mattered to him, and he had gone into the underworld to take it back. He had walked down through a door in the rock and he had come out on the other side of the world, into a country of the dead and the things that ate the dead, and he had carried out what he came for. The story was 1,000 years old in the old language. Pear said the old word for the door was the same word their village had used for Pedralta. The balancing stone was a marker. Underneath it, somewhere, there was supposed to be the way down. I will tell you I did not believe him. Not that night. I sat there and I listened to a grieving man tell a folk tale about a rock, and I thought he had broken, and I thought we had all broken, and I wanted to go to sleep and not wake up. Vigilant believed him. Vigilant put his cup down very slowly and he said, "The hive is under the headlands. We have known that since the 2nd month. We can feel it through the rock. The tributaries come up through the cracks and they go back down through the cracks, and we have never found the cracks wide enough to fit a man because they do not need them wide enough. But the stone is on the highest point of the cape. The stone is on top of the deepest pine country. If there is a way in that a man could walk, it would be there." Pear looked at him. The fire was low. Bet was breathing slowly beside him, and her face in the firelight was the face of the girl I had known since she was a child, except for the pits of her, except for the focus. "You are telling me," Pear said, "that you want to go down." "I am telling you," Vigilant said, "that we are going to die in 8 months, and that I would rather die doing something my father would have recognized as a thing worth doing." I said before I knew I was going to say it, "If we go, we bring her back." I meant Bet. I meant Bet's song. I meant the pattern of her, whatever they had taken, the thing Pear had called the song of her. I meant we go down into the Hive and we find their library if they had a library, and we take her back out of it, and we put her back into the body that was sitting beside her father drinking soup out of a spoon. I did not know if it could be done. I did not know if any of it was real. I said it anyway, because Per was sitting there with his life in his lap, and he was about to be told that the only chance for her was to send him into a hole in the ground, and I did not want him to have to ask. Per looked at me for a long time. The fire popped. Bet's breathing did not change. "All right," he said. "All right, Alex, we go." There were 4 of us in the end who went under Pedralta. Vigilant, Per, me, and a young man named Tomu who had grown up in the salvage camps and who had killed 2 tributaries by himself with a pulse rifle and a length of pipe in the 2nd week of the war, and who did not seem to be afraid of anything any more in a way that worried me. We argued, the rest of us, about whether to take more. Vigilant said 4. He said any more than 4 and we would be heard before we got 50 meters in. He said the rest had to stay above ground, because the rest above ground were what was left of Vora, and if we did not come back somebody had to keep Vora alive for as long as Vora could be kept alive. We brought what we could carry. 3 pulse carbines and Vigilant's old powder rifle that he would not give up even though it was heavier than the carbines and slower to reload. We brought light. We brought rope, a great deal of rope, because Per had said the legend spoke of a long climb in the dark. We brought water and we brought the dried fish, and we brought a sealed canister of the chemical the salvage crews used to mark wreckage in deep water, a yellow paste that glowed faintly for about 100 hours after exposure to air. We were going to mark our path. We were going to leave a way back. And we brought Bet. That was Per's condition. He would not go without her. The body, he said, was still the body, and if there was a way to put her back into it, then she had to be near, and he was not going to leave her in the workshop with whoever was left of the village to take care of her like a piece of livestock. He carried her himself in a sling across his back, the way you carry a child who has fallen asleep on a long walk. She did not resist. She did not help. She was a warm weight, and she breathed, and her eyes were open most of the time, and she did not see us. We left in the gray hour before the white sun came up. Vora was very quiet. Nobody saw us off. That was Vigilant's instruction. He said farewells were a kind of noise too. The climb up to Pedralta took us most of the morning. The pine country was steeper than I remembered, and we were carrying weight, and Per was carrying weight twice over. By the time we reached the balancing stone, the white sun was high and the red sun had come up under it, and the long shadow of Pedralta lay across the pines like a finger pointing east. The stone was bigger than I remembered. I had not been up there since I was a boy. The chapel-sized rock sat on its smaller pedestal as it had sat for 10,000 years or 100,000, and the wind moved around it, the way wind moves around something that has been there long enough to have made friends with it. Vigilant walked around the base 3 times. He stopped on the eastern side, where the pedestal stone met the ground in a tight seam, and he knelt and put his hand on the seam and closed his eyes. "Here," he said. I did not feel anything. I knelt next to him and I put my hand where his had been and I did not feel anything, and then I did. It was not a vibration exactly. It was a pressure. A low, even pressure, the kind you feel in your jaw when a storm is coming a long way off. The hive. The library. Whatever was down there, it was down there, and it was very large, and we were on top of it. Tomu came up behind us with a length of pipe and a small charge. Vigilant looked at him and nodded once, and Tomu set the charge in the seam and the rest of us moved back, and Per turned his body to put Bet on the far side of him from the blast. The charge went. The pedestal stone did not move. Pedralta sat where it had sat, but the seam at the base, the place Vigilant had put his hand, opened. It opened the way a wound opens. The rock split and a draft came up out of the split, and the draft was warm and smelled like wet ash and old salt, and somewhere far below it there was a sound that I had heard before only on the salvage radio, a running water sound, a flow. Vigilant looked at me. He had the face of a man who had hoped he was wrong. "All right," he said. "Alex, You first, son, rope on, light low. We mark the wall every 10 meters. We do not speak unless we have to. We do not stop unless one of us is bleeding. If any of us is taken, the others do not stop. Are we agreed? We were agreed. I went first because I was the youngest who could read a tunnel. That was the salvage logic. The young eyes go forward, the experienced hands hold the rope. I went down into the split and the rope paid out behind me and the air got warmer with every step and the sound of the flow got louder. And after about 30 meters, the split widened into a passage that a man could walk in upright. And I knew, the way you know certain things in your bones, that we were not in any tunnel that a tributary had dug. The walls were too smooth. The angles were too clean. Something older had made this. Something that had been here before the tributaries and that the tributaries had only found, the way we had found the old terraformer in the pines and used. I marked the wall with the yellow paste. The mark glowed faintly behind me. I went on. The others came down. Vigilant first, then Tomu, then Pear with Bet on his back. Pear's breathing was loud. He was a strong man, but he was 61 years old and he had been carrying his daughter for 2 hours, and he was going to keep carrying her for as long as we were down there. He did not complain. He did not ask for help. I had a moment of love for him that I have not had for many men in my life. I will not pretend I remember the passage perfectly. We were under there for what Vigilant later said was about 9 hours, and there were stretches I could not put in order even now. I remember the first chamber. It was the size of a salvage hangar and the ceiling was lost in the dark, and the walls were lined with something I thought at first were ribs and then realized were columns. Thousands of columns of the pale silica that the tributary shells were made of, set into the rock, the way teeth are set into a jaw. The columns hummed. They hummed at a pitch you could feel in your sternum, and Vigilant put his glove on the nearest column and pulled his hand back fast, and he said very quietly, "These are full." Full, I understood him. We all did. The columns were full. They were not the library themselves. They were the shelves. We did not stay in the first chamber. Vigilant said we had to go deeper. The legend, Pear said, had spoken of a hall at the bottom. The hall was where the souls were kept. If Bet was anywhere, she would be in the hall. We followed a corridor out of the first chamber, and the corridor went down a long time. We left yellow marks every 10 meters. We did not see any tributaries. We heard them twice. The creaking of the shells, distant and Vigilant, raised a hand and we stopped breathing. And the creaking went past us in some other passage and went on. And we went on. And that was all. There were small chambers off the main corridor, and we did not go into them, but I looked into one of them briefly, when my light swung. It was a room about the size of a workshop, and the walls were lined with the same silica columns as the first chamber, except smaller, the size of a man's forearm, and they were arranged in rows the way a man might arrange jars on a shelf. The columns were not humming. They were dark, and the silica was cloudy in a way the other columns had not been, and I understood without anyone telling me that these were the ones that had been emptied. The patterns had been moved out of them, down to the floor of the hall where the schools were. The shelves were where the tributaries kept the new takings before they sorted them. The dark columns were the old shelves, the ones they had finished with. There must have been 10,000 columns in that one small room. I did not count. I moved my light away, and I went on after Vigilant, and I did not look into the other side rooms. About halfway down, by Pear's reckoning, we came to a place where the corridor split. The split was not natural. The two passages went off at angles a hive does not bother making. The left one sloped down sharply. The right one was nearly level. Vigilant stood at the split for a long minute with his hand on the wall, and he closed his eyes the way he had closed them on the seam under Pedralta, and then he opened them and he pointed left. "The pressure is down there," he said. "Whatever the floor is, it is down there." We went left. The slope was steep enough that we had to brace against the walls. Pear went carefully because of Bet. Tomu went behind him, ready to catch them both. I went in front because that was the order. The air got warmer. The smell of wet ash got stronger. The running water sound got louder, and after a while I realized it was not coming from in front of us. It was coming from underneath. from beneath the floor of the corridor itself. We were walking on top of the library now. The whole hive was a roof over the library. The tributaries lived above their cellar the way a farmer lives above his root cellar, and they came down to it, the way the farmer comes down to his potatoes. And the analogy was not one I wanted to be having while I was inside it, but I could not stop having it. I am not going to lie about the second chamber. The second chamber is the part I would take out of this account if I could. It was a feeding hall. That is the only word I have for it. There were tributaries in it, perhaps 30 of them, standing in a circle around a pit, and the pit was full of what I will only call the substance, the gray pulp, and there were human bodies floating in the substance, and the tributaries were lowering their long, thin limbs into the pit and drawing the substance up and putting it into the pits of themselves, the sensory pits, the things they had instead of faces, and the substance was making them sing. They were singing a chord. It was a chord made of many voices, and the voices were human. I knew 2 of the voices. One of them was the voice of old Marcel, who had taught me to gut a salvage drone. The other was the voice of my brother-in-law Geordie. I had to put my face into my sleeve. Vigilant put his hand on the back of my neck, hard, and held me there, and after a moment I could move again, and we went around the second chamber by a side passage, and we did not speak about it for the rest of the descent. We have not spoken about it since. I am writing it down now because someone has to, and because the men who knew are mostly gone. The hall at the bottom, the hall. I have been trying for 2 weeks to find the words for the hall. I do not think I have them. I will say what I can. It was vast. The ceiling was high enough that our lights did not find it. The floor was a single sheet of the pale silica, and the silica was clear, the way the clearest sea water is clear, and you could see down into it, for I do not know how far, and what you saw down there were the patterns, the songs, the library. They moved. They were not still. They were moving the way schools of fish move, the way a flock of birds moves at dusk, turning together in the deep, lit faintly from within, and every one of them was a person. Every one of them. I do not know how many there were. Thousands, tens of thousands, more than the tributaries could have taken from us. They had been doing this on other worlds. They had been doing this for a very long time. The hall was older than us, and the tributaries were only the latest stewards of it, and what I felt looking down through the floor was not horror exactly. It was something colder than horror. It was the understanding that we had walked into the cellar of a house we had not known was a house, and that the house had been here before we existed. Vigilant put his hand on the floor. He did not weep. I have never seen Vigilant weep then or since, but his jaw did a thing I had not seen before. "Alakes," he said, "Pear, we are going to do this fast." We did it fast. Pear laid Bet down on the silica floor. Her eyes were open. She was still breathing. Pear took her face in his hands, and he leaned down and he spoke into her ear in the old language, the language I have only ever heard from his generation and from his grandmother's generation before him, and I do not know what he said to her, and I will not guess. Then he stood up, and he told us the rest of the legend. The man in the old story, Pear said, had not gone into the underworld with a weapon. He had not fought the things that ate the dead. He had gone in and he had found the one he had come for, and he had called the one he had come for by her name, and her name had been enough. The things that ate the dead had no use for a name. A name was a human shape. The thing that the dead were in the underworld was a thing without a shape, and a name put the shape back, and the shape was the way out. I will tell you, when Pear said this, I thought he had finally broken. I thought we had come all this way down through a hive of silica monsters and a feeding hall full of our friends in liquid form, and at the bottom of it, Pear was going to recite a folk tale to a clear floor, and we were all going to die under the headlands. But Vigilant said very quietly, "Try it." Pear knelt on the floor. The patterns moved under his knees, slow as schools of fish. He bent his face down to the silica until his forehead touched it, and he said his daughter's name. "Bet," he said. Nothing, the patterns moved. "Bet," he said again, the patterns moved. He said her full name. He said the name her mother had given her, the long Catalan name with the second name and the family name on the end of it, and he said it the way a father says it when his daughter is small and has wandered off in a market, and he is trying to call her back without sounding afraid. He said it 3 times. He said it 4. By the 5th time he was no longer kneeling on the floor. He was lying down on it, his whole body, his face pressed to the cold, clear silica, and he was saying her name the way I have only heard a man say a name once in my life, and the body of Bet was lying next to him with her eyes open and her breathing even and the pits of her unfocused, and somewhere down in the floor in the deep, one of the patterns turned. I saw it turn, I will swear to that. One of the patterns in the great moving school turned out of its line and came up. It came up slowly. It came up the way a fish comes up to the surface of a still pond to take a fly. It came up under Pear and it stopped just under the silica, just under his face, and it lit the floor pale blue, and it was the shape of a young woman, and she was looking up at him. Pear did not move. He said her name once more, very softly. He said it the way a man says a prayer he is not sure anyone is listening to. The pattern under the silica reached up. I do not know how to say this. It reached up and the silica did not break, and her hand came through the silica anyway, the way a hand comes through water, and Pear caught her hand in his hand and he pulled. He pulled her up out of the floor. The body of Bet beside him took a long shuddering breath. The eyes closed, the eyes opened. The pits of her, the focus, the human focus, came back. She looked at her father. She blinked once. She said in a small voice, the kind of voice you have when you have just been woken from a dream you cannot remember, Pear. He held her, he just held her. He did not speak. Vigilant turned his back on them, and I understood why, and I turned my back too, and Tomu turned his back. And we 3 stood with our backs to the father, and the daughter for I do not know how long, and the patterns in the floor moved around us in their schools, and somewhere far above us, the hive went on humming its long, slow song that we had walked into the middle of. That is when the tributaries came. I do not know how they knew. I think they felt the pattern leave the floor. I think we had pulled a piece of their library up out of the shelf and the library had noticed, and they had come. There were 6 of them in the corridor we had come down. We could hear the shells creaking. We could hear the singing start up, and the singing was not a chord this time. It was a single high note, the note they sang when they were hunting, and we had heard that note before in the lower town the morning they took Bet. Vigilant looked at me. He looked at Tomu. He looked at Pear, who was on his knees holding his daughter, and at Bet, who was sitting up and looking around her with the slow focus of a person who has been asleep for a long time and is trying to remember the room. "Alakes," Vigilant said. "You take them, you take Pear and Bet and Tomu, and you take the rope and you go up. You go fast. You do not stop, you mark nothing. The marks are already there. You follow them up." "Vigilant," I said. "I have the powder rifle," he said. "I have 11 rounds. I am 68 years old, son, and my knees do not like the climb, and I have been waiting 40 years for a fight that mattered. Go." Tomu did not move. Tomu said, "2 rifles is better than 1. Vigilant looked at him a long moment. Then he nodded once. "2 rifles," he said. "Alakes Pear Bet up." I will not say what I felt. There is nothing to say. I picked Bet up because Pear's arms were shaking too hard to carry her, and Pear followed me and we ran. We ran back up the corridor a different way. The side passage we had taken around the feeding hall, and behind us the powder rifle started, slow and heavy, and the pulse carbine started, faster, and the high note of the tributaries stopped being a note and became a screaming. And I do not know how long the firing went on because I was running and Pear was running behind me and Bet was light in my arms, much lighter than I had expected. And the yellow marks were on the walls every 10 meters and they glowed faintly, and they were the only thing I let myself look at. We came up out of the seam under Pedralta into the red dusk. The white sun had set. The big red one was low. The pine country was full of long shadows, and the wind was moving in the trees, and there was nobody on the cape, no vigilant in his bunker, no figure at the long glass, only the wind. The seam was still open. I set Bet down on the pine needles, and Pear sat down beside her and put his face in his hands, and we waited. We waited a long time. The firing under the rock went on for a while, and then it stopped. Then there was a silence that was not a silence. It was the low pressure in the rock, the hum of the hive, going on as it had gone on for the 10,000 years before us. Tomu came up out of the seam alone. He had a burn down one side of his face that he would carry for the rest of his life, and that he never had set properly because there was nobody on Vora who knew how. He had Vigilance powder rifle in his hand. He had no rounds left in it. He looked at me and at Pear and at Bet, who was sitting up and watching him with her own eyes again, and he said, "He held them. He held them long enough." Then Tomu sat down on the pine needles next to us, and he did not say anything else for about an hour. We sealed the seam the next day. Tomu had brought the rest of our charges back up with him, and we set them in the rock at the base of the pedestal, and we set them deep, and we blew the seam in. Pedralta did not move. The balancing stone sat as it had sat, and the seam under it was rock again, and if you walked around the base now you would not see where we had been. We did not put up a marker for Vigilant. There was no body to put one for. We knew where he was. That was 4 years ago. I want to be honest about what we did and what we did not do. We did not win the war. The Tributaries were still out there, in the hive under the headlands, with their library of stolen songs and their feeding halls and their long, slow patience. We had taken one pattern back out of their library, and we had killed perhaps a dozen of them in the corridor where Vigilance stayed, and that was all. The orbital authority never came. The colony charter stayed expired. Vora is smaller now than it was when the Tributaries surfaced. We are about 70 people in the lower town, and we get smaller every season, and most of us are old. But the Tributaries do not come up under Pedralta anymore. We have watched. Tomu watches now, from Vigilance bunker, with Vigilance glass, and the seam under the balancing stone is closed, and the hive has not opened it again. I do not know what we did exactly. I do not know if we frightened them, which I doubt, or if we showed them something they did not know about us, which I think is closer. I think when we pulled Bet's pattern up out of the floor, we did something they had never seen a prey species do. I think the running water voices in the library, when they were not full of new songs, had begun to whisper among themselves. I think the long, slow patience of the Tributaries is being eaten, very slowly, by a thing they did not expect to be eaten by, which is the slow understanding that the small, loud animals on the surface will come down into the cellar of the house if you take what belongs to them. Bet lives, she is 26 now. She does not remember the time she was empty, and we do not tell her about it, although I think Pear has told her some of it in the old language by the fire, the way his grandmother told him about the man who went into the underworld. She runs the lower workshop. Her hands are her mother's hands. She fixes things. Pear is still alive. He is 65. He walks slower than he did, and he sleeps badly, and he keeps the picture of Vigilant on the workshop wall the way you keep a picture of someone you owe a debt to that you cannot ever pay. Tomu I do not see much. He is on the cape most days with the glass, and at night he comes down and he eats with us, and he does not speak more than he has to. The burn on the side of his face has gone white with time. He is 28 years old. He has the eyes of a man who slept 4 hours a night by choice, and I do not say this lightly, but he has Vigilance eyes now. I think the watch is the kind of thing that gets passed on whether anyone means to pass it on or not. As for me, I am 35. I still work the salvage. I bury bones when I find them, and I bury them properly. I do not go up to Pedralta anymore. I do not need to. I can feel it from the lower town, the same way I can feel the hum of the hive under the headlands, and I can feel that the seam is closed, and I sleep about as well as a man can sleep on a coast like this, which is to say not very, but well enough. I will tell you the last thing. In the 3rd year after we came back up out of the rock, Pear came to my workshop one evening with a bottle of the colorless brandy his grandmother used to make, and that nobody else on Vora knows the recipe for any more. He sat down on the bench across from me and he poured 2 cups and we drank, and after a while he said, "Alakes, do you ever think about what we did?" I said I thought about it most days. He said, "Do you think we did the right thing, going down, bringing her back?" I thought about it for a long while. I thought about Vigilant in the corridor with the powder rifle and his 11 rounds. I thought about the patterns moving in the silica floor like schools of fish at dusk. I thought about Bet now, fixing a transmitter at her bench in the workshop, frowning at it the way her mother used to frown, her hands doing the work without her watching them. I thought about old Marcel's voice in the cord in the feeding hall, and I thought about my brother-in-law Geordie, and I thought about all the people who were still down there in the library, in the School of the Dead, and who would never come up because there was nobody left who knew their names. I said, I think we did the only thing. Pear nodded. He did not say anything for a while. Then he poured the 2nd cup and he raised it, the way men of his generation raise a cup when they are thinking about a man who is not in the room. He raised it toward the cape, toward Pedralta, toward the bunker on the high point where Tomu was watching the headlands with the long glass. "To Vigilant," he said. "To Vigilant," I said. We drank. The red sun was low over the black water, and the wind was coming up out of the pine country, and somewhere a long way under our feet. In the cellar of the house we had walked into, the library went on humming its long, slow song of all the people it had taken from us and from the worlds before us. But the seam was closed. The pedestal stone was where it had been for 10,000 years. The girl was at her bench with her own hands and her own focus and her own name in her own head, and the watch was on the cape, and we were still here, on the edge of human reach, on a coast that no map of Earth would recognize, and we were going to be here for as long as we could manage it. That is what I came to write down. That is what the rock cost us and what we paid to take her back. I do not know if anyone will read this. I do not know if anyone will ever come looking for us, or for what is left of us, or for the hall under the headlands and the schools of the dead in its floor. I am going to put this in the salvage archive anyway. We were a fence post they walked past on their way to the orchard. We took one of ours back out of their cellar. We buried the man who held the corridor for us, in the rock that holds him still. If you find this, and you are human, and you have come to this coast for any reason at all, I will tell you the one thing I have learned, and the only thing worth carrying away from the rock. We are the species that goes down after our own. We always have been. We always will be. And the things that live in the cellars of the old houses, in the libraries of the slow, patient harvesters, in the hives under the headlands of worlds we were never supposed to reach, are going to learn that, one cellar at a time, until there are no more cellars left. I am Alakes. I worked the salvage. I went down under Pedralta with 3 good men, and I came back up with 2 of them and a girl who had her own name in her head again, and I have written this down because somebody had to, and because the wind is up tonight, and because the cup is empty, and because the watch on the cape is lit, and because I am still here.